Welcome to the San Ramon Valley Democratic Club. My name is Brody Hilp. I serve as president. I'm here with our communications director, Cecilia Manalga. Do you know what the #1 concern is for Democrats in California? I'm certain you do. Stopping the recall of our governor. It's time to get involved. The easiest thing you can do is talk to your friends and talk to your family. The election is September 14th. One way to help is to do a phone bank or set up a table at the Danville Farmers Market, or get involved by hanging our 27-foot banner at overpasses. Look for the information on how to sign up in our SRV DC emails. If you don't receive them, the information on how to sign up for our emails is in chat. And if you do receive our emails, you will learn how to sign up for our next meeting in August with Congressman Eric Swalwell. So tonight we have an incredible meeting. We are deeply happy and truly grateful for our amazing speakers tonight, Dr. William Darity and Kirsten Mullen, who have waived their honorarium fee to speak tonight and tell us about the book that they have written, From Here to Equality, Reparations for Black Americans in the 21st Century. This is really an amazing book. Considering order copying from our local bookstore, Rakestraw Books, or you might think about buying a few copies for your local high school or library. So look in chat on how to order your copy. So now let me introduce you to the authors who have joined us all the way from the East Coast. Dr. William Darity is a professor of 1, public policy, 2, economics, 3, African American studies at Duke University. He's also the director of the Samuel DuBois Cook Center on Social Equity at Duke University. And I thought, who is Samuel DuBois Cook? So I looked it up, and he was a civil rights activist, and he was the first Black faculty member at Duke University in the 1960s. Also at Duke University, Dr. Darity was the founding director of the Research Network on Racial and Ethnic Inequality. When Dr. Darity was at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, he was the director of the Institute of African American Research. What is his educational background? He majored in economics and political science for his undergraduate degree at Brown University. And then he studied at the London School of Economics and Political Science. He went on to receive his doctorate in economics at MIT. He has received a countless number of research grants, honors, and awards. One that might be of interest to our Bay Area is that he was a fellow at the Center for Advanced Study in the Behavioral Sciences at Sanford University. He has published or edited 13 books and published more than 300 professional articles. Kirsten Mullen is a writer, folklorist, museum consultant, and lecturer whose work focuses on race, art history, and politics. For example, she's the founder of Artifactual, an arts consulting practice, and Carolina Circuit Writers, a literary consortium that brings expressive writers of color to the Carolinas. She collaborated with the groups Freelon and Adje, which won from the Smithsonian Institute the right to come up with the idea and develop the design of the National Museum of African American History and Culture in DC. And if you go there, you can tell the exterior is this elaborate ironwork that evoke the 19th century ironwork created by enslaved craftsmen from New Orleans. Kirsten writes for museum catalogs, journals, and commercial media. She wrote an in-depth article, Black Culture and History Matter, which examines the politics of funding Black cultural institutions. That was published in the American Prospect, which you might know is edited by progressive David Dayen. So now let's hear from the authors of From Here to Equality, Reparations for Black Americans in the 21st Century. Dr. Darity and Kirsten, thank you so much for speaking at our meeting.
Thank you so much for that generous introduction, Brody. We really appreciate it. And we're very grateful to the San Ramon Valley Democratic Club for this opportunity to share in this conversation this evening. It is stunning to hear how often the term reparations is being bandied about. Prior to presidential candidate Marianne Williams's invocation of the term during her campaign in January 2019, few politicians dared speak the word. The problem today, though, is the term is being applied to a host of acts of individual and community atonement that are worlds away from true reparations. So we would like to begin by sharing our definition of reparations. As Sandy and I write in our recent book, From Here to Equality, Reparations for Black Americans in the 21st Century, when we speak of reparations, we mean a program of acknowledgement, redress, and closure, or ARC, A-R-C, for a grievous injustice. Examples include the US government's provision of restitution for Japanese Americans who were unjustly incarcerated during World War II. Each victim received $20,000, approximately $40,000 in today's currency. The German government's provision of compensation for victims of the Nazi Holocaust, about $89 billion before 2020, and at least $662 million since the onset of the pandemic. And in a more unusual case, one in which the US government was not the perpetrator, the nation made reparations payments to the Americans held hostage in Iran, calculated at $10,000 per day of captivity, for an average of $4.3 million per person. It's an extraordinary reparations grant program. By acknowledgement, we mean that the responsible party, the party that has benefited from the injury, admits that they have committed harm and simultaneously declare that they will engage in an act of restitution. The important thing here is acknowledgement extends beyond an apology and includes a declaration that a tangible form of redress will follow. So redress, that second component, is the act of restitution for the injustice. Unlike, say, atonement, we have clear metrics for determining when restitution has been achieved, and we'll get to those metrics shortly. The third component is closure, which involves mutual conciliation between Black American descendants of US slavery and the beneficiaries not only of slavery, but of nearly a century of legal segregation and ongoing discrimination toward Blacks. We're talking here about a period of upwards of 100 massacres that took place nationwide in Wilmington, North Carolina, Atlanta, Tulsa, Oklahoma, Ocoee, Florida, Omaha, Nebraska, Brisbane, Arizona, between the end of the Civil War and the end of World War II. Blacks were run out, burned out, injured, and murdered out of their homes and communities. Fearful of returning and frequently unable to negotiate on their own behalf, these refugees watched as white mobsters appropriated their property outright or purchased it for pennies on the dollar. Anti-Black violence and discrimination in education, employment, housing, credit markets, and most importantly, the racial wealth gap, all are very much evidence in and across the United States today. Closure, the C of ARC, can be achieved when the victimized community and the responsible party come to an agreement that the debt has been paid. So, what will get us to true reparations? We believe that 4 features are essential to a true reparations plan for Black American descendants of US slavery. So first, the plan must carefully indicate who is eligible. 2 conditions are critical. Eligible recipients must prove they are descended from at least one ancestor who was enslaved in the United States. These are the individuals who bear the burden of the cumulative intergenerational effects of all 3 periods of racial atrocities. So we're talking about government policies and the acts of white mobsters. So recipients also must show that they self-identified as Black, African American, Negro, or Afro-American on an official document at least 12 years prior to the onset of a reparations program. Second, any true reparations plan must eliminate the nation's huge Black-white wealth gap. Black American descendants of US slavery represent about 12% of the nation's population, but possess less than 2% of the nation's wealth. The wealth gap is simply the best cumulative economic indicator of the damages caused by American racism across generations. Third, payments must be made directly to the eligible claimants. As in previous cases, such as German payments to Holocaust victims and US payments to citizens and non-citizens of Japanese descent for their internment during World War II, recipients must have discretion over the funds received as restitution. And finally, and critically, the bill will have to be paid by the federal government. So bringing the Black share of American wealth in line with the Black share of the population would ultimately require an expenditure of at least $12 trillion. So in recent months, several states and local governments have proposed independent quote unquote reparations initiatives, but they do not have sufficient resources to pay the bill. Collectively, this is the sum of an annual budget of all states and local governments is $3.1 trillion. And individually, local municipalities, such as Evanston, Illinois, for example, generally do not have the resources to pay Black reparations in a meaningful way. The federal government, found more than $5 trillion in a single year in a response to the COVID-19 emergency. This moral act could be true. This moral act would be. The moral would be, for the federal government to decide that it would do the right thing to exercise its obligation, to exercise its will, and to designate funds for reparations for Black American descendants of U.S. slavery. So when we talk about the case for African American reparations, we're referring to a plan of action that will place America on a path to racial equality. So now Sandy's going to talk about some of the the off-ramps, the detours from the path to true reparations.
The widespread use of the term reparations means a huge amount of terrain is covered by a wide variety of initiatives. And many of these initiatives are actually a detour from true reparations, no matter how promising they may appear to be on the face of it. So Kirsten mentioned the array of local reparations initiatives, inclusive of what has been with the legislation that was recently passed in Evanston, Illinois. The state of California, interestingly enough, has a reparations task force that is trying to consider and determine what types of steps should be taken that would be specific to the state of California. And we certainly think that there's a host of policies and practices that can be reversed or altered that currently are doing severe damage to Black Americans specifically. But we don't think that those types of reversals should be referred to as reparations. As Kirsten pointed out, the total budgets for all state and local governments in the United States are approximately $3.1 trillion, but the requirement for elimination of the racial wealth gap would be in the vicinity of $12 trillion. So all the states and localities in combination would have to devote their entire budgets to a reparations fund for upwards of 4 years, meaning that they could not fulfill any of their other responsibilities to their constituents. For upwards of 4 years, which is clearly an impossible task. If we're to think about Los Angeles specifically, we estimate that it would require about $90 billion to close the wealth gap for the Black residents of the city of LA. The city's entire budget is $11.2 billion. Consider the entire state of California. We estimate that it would cost about $600 billion to eliminate the wealth gap for California's Black residents. But The state's total budget is about $200 billion. So it's impossible for the states and localities to accomplish the goal of elimination of the racial wealth grab. That will require a federal reparations program. And we should not be misled by state and local initiatives that are passing under the label of reparations. Secondly, frequently people say that the focus on monetary payments is something that's not sufficient or adequate. Over and over again, we hear the phrase that reparations should not be just a check. Well, from our perspective, you should not minimize the implications of just a check, especially when we're talking about essentially payments of about $300,000 per eligible recipient in the Black American community. And that payment is the payment that would be adequate for erasing the racial wealth differential, and it would have tremendous transformative effects. Excuse me. It would alter the political landscape in terms of the degree of influence that could be exercised by Black Americans. It would alter the array of opportunities that are available to younger Black Americans, and it would provide sustained economic security for Black American households. And so yeah, just a check is not a bad thing. The third off ramp is the claim, the frequently made claim that it's impossible to tell who should receive reparations. But Kirsten has already talked about the two criteria that we have in mind, a lineage standard and an identity standard that would link the recipients today to their ancestors who were denied the 40-acre land grants that were promised in the aftermath of the Civil War. Those 40-acre land grants were intended as restitution for the years of bondage, but that restitution was never met. It was a promise that was unfulfilled. And at the same time, the federal government was providing 1.5 million white American families with 160-acre land grants under the terms of the Homestead Act of 1862. This permitted the growing nation or expanding nation to complete its colonial settler project. But in the process, it has had ramifications across the generations, not just in terms of the lack of wealth on the part of Black Americans or the inability of Black Americans to transfer substantial amounts of wealth to subsequent generations, but also in terms of the wealth that has been accumulated on the part of white Americans, where today it's estimated that 45 million living white Americans are beneficiaries of the effects of the land grants under the Homestead Act. The fourth off-ramp is associated with a variety of alternatives that people propose to reparations as a program of direct payments to eligible recipients. People frequently refer to other alternatives, which could be indirect approaches or universal programs. And let me say at the outset that I'm an advocate of many of these universal programs. In fact, I contributed to the development of what some of us call an economic bill of rights for the 21st century, which includes an array of programs that would make major structural changes in the United States occur that would be designed to apply to all American citizens. But there is an unmet debt that is associated with the case for reparations, a debt that has been outstanding for at least 155 years. And that's a debt that cannot be met through universal programs, even if they disproportionately benefit Black Americans. A couple of examples are illustrative here. The first example is the claim that's frequently made that student loan debt or elimination of student loan debt would close the racial wealth gap. This is absolutely untrue. If you do the calculation carefully, taking into account the fact that there are enrollment rate differences between Blacks and whites, the net gain in terms of the wealth gap would be in the vicinity of about $2,000 per person, and we've been talking about a gap of $300,000. As for another universal program that would be, I think, would be highly beneficial for the country as a whole. The baby bonds proposal, which is the provision of a trust account for every newborn infant, calibrated on the basis of their parents' wealth. Under the best terms of execution of that program, the most it could do is reduce the racial wealth gap by 20% or so. So neither of those universal programs will turn the trick. And if we were to take into account others that have been proposed, neither singly nor collectively would they eliminate the racial wealth gap. As for indirect approaches, approaches that are specific to Black Americans, but indirect in the sense that they don't make payments specifically to individual eligible recipients, that won't work either. Okay. So frequently people talk about the provision of college scholarships. Well, that's a great idea, and I'm a strong proponent of the intrinsic value of education. But the extrinsic benefit will not be present here with respect to the wealth gap. In the present moment, Black heads of household with a college degree have 2/3 of the net worth of white heads of household who never finished high school. And this is because of the differences in the opportunities to transfer resources across generations that are wealth linked. And so another set of universal programs, of indirect programs that people frequently invoke are various kinds of economic development programs for at the community level or at the city or municipal level. But the difficulty here is that our neighborhoods are rapidly changing in composition as a consequence of mechanisms of gentrification. And so there's no assurance that neighborhood level or community level programs will deliver the resources to the individuals who merit them. And so in the work that we've done, we've emphasized person-based programs as opposed to place-based programs. And then the final off-ramp that we'd like to discuss is associated with the legislation to create a commission to study and develop proposals for reparations at the federal level, legislation that goes under the nomenclature of HR 40, which is a nod to the 40 acres. But Kirsten and I are in a peculiar position with respect to that piece of legislation, because although we are passionate advocates of reparations, we think that this piece of legislation is seriously flawed. And I'm going to pass it back to Kirsten to talk about HR 40, and then I think we'll open up the floor for conversation.
So there are two types of problems that we see with HR 40 as it is currently written. Some of you may be aware that the legislation went through a markup session in March, April of this year, and a number of revisions were made, none of them to the good, right? So I'm going to talk a little bit about what's not in HR 40 and some of the things that have been added to HR 40 that make it a problematic piece of legislation. So one of the things that we think a bill of this type should do is give direction, give a directive to the commission members. And we find that the bill is deficient in this area. So for us, a reparations bill should identify who the eligible recipients are, and HR 40 does not do that. And as we've said, these are individuals who are descended from the people who were enslaved in the United States and promised but denied those 40-acre land grants, individuals who self-identify as Black African-American, Negro, or Afro-American at least 12 years prior to the onset of a reparations program. HR 40 does not speak to this at all. HR 40 does not say that direct payments should be made to eligible recipients, nor does it focus on the elimination of the racial wealth gap as a primary goal. And then fourthly, HR 40 does not identify the federal government as the culpable party. So for us, just structurally, the bill is just woefully deficient. But in addition, there are a number of changes that were made to the bill that are are just peculiar, So bear with me. I'm going to just sort of run down some of the changes that that we have observed that have been made over the 30 years the bill has been in existence. So when the bill was first introduced by John Conyers in 1989, it provided for $8 million budget. The bill has been revised several times. That budget jumped from 8 to 12 and it's now $20 million. The salaries for, the number of commissioners initially was 7, and then it jumped to 13, and now there are 15 commissioners. Interestingly, a quorum can be established by only 7 members. So not a majority even, not a supermajority, but 7 of 15 is all that required for a quorum. The director of the commission, who is someone who is not appointed by the president, the pro tempore, the head of the House, the Speaker of the House, or the pro tempore of the Senate, that person has the authority to select 6 members of the 15. So someone who is not a member of the commission has the authority to select 6 members. And so if they had the support of those 6 and one other person, they would have a quorum and could conduct business for the commission as a whole. It's just an unusual provision for commission of this type. So there's a provision for salary, which I think is an odd piece, and I'll speak to that in a moment. But the salary now, as a revision state, can be as high as an executive level 4 for federal employment, and so this is $172,000 a year. So the commissioners have extended the length of time that the commission would be in force. So a much longer period of time that they would be receiving this $172,000 a year. Now, for the most part, commissions of this type, the members are not paid. They are serving pro bono. This is not, thought to be full-time work. They would have, a professional staff that would be working, an administrative staff, but also researchers, scholars who they would call upon to conduct research for them. It is not the expectation in commissions of this type that the commissioners themselves are doing primary research. Those individuals absolutely should be paid. And any expenses that the commissioners incur should be paid. But we do not think that commissioners especially on a reparations commission, which for us is a sacred mission, that they should be paid to do this work. Interestingly,
could I add that with respect to the California Reparations Task Force, the members are not paid.
They're not being paid.
And they do have a professional staff from the state's Department of Justice that is providing the legwork and groundwork that they need.
And they're full-time. But the commissioners themselves are not paid. This is very peculiar addition here for HR 40. They also stipulate that no elected officials and no government employees may serve. So no mayors, no governors, no members of, no cabinet members, no senators, no Congress members, period, may serve. And this is, problematic in our view, because when you have elected officials serving on commissions of this sort, that increases the credibility of the commission. I mean, these are individuals who are beholden to constituents. These commission members will be beholden to no one, as the commission is currently devised. As it happens, government employees cannot be paid to serve on commissions of this sort. And we think that is possibly the reason why they decided not to allow government officials or government employees to serve, because they wanted to be sure that everyone who serves on this commission does in fact get paid. The last major point I wanted to make about the changes that were made, this commission, the folks who revised the commission have requested an exemption to the Federal Advisory Commission Act. So this is legislation that was created to make sure that commissions did their work in the light of day, which is to say that they had public involvement, that they held public hearings, that they had public notification of meetings, that their minutes, the transcriptions of their minutes, notifications would be available to the public. This commission is asking to be exempt from that entirely. So it is conceivable that they could, conduct their work privately and submit their recommendations, and the lifetime of the commission will have ended, and there'll be no opportunity for the public to make any comment or ask any questions at all. So we're just, we don't really understand, what the motivation was for setting up the commission, or I should say for changing the commission in such a way that it precludes the opportunity for the public to have involvement.
And again, that contrasts with the California Reparations Task Force,
absolutely,
just subject to legislation that's known as Bagley-Keene,
yes,
which requires transparency of the
yes.
task force deliberations and activities.
And when you think about a commission like the one that worked on the Japanese American redress plan, this is the Commission on Wartime Relocation of Internment of Civilians. They held, I think, 11 or 12 public hearings across the country. They were all open to the public. Some 750 people gave public testimony. Several thousand people gave written testimony. They went out of their way to make sure that the public had the opportunity to weigh in on the work that they were doing. There absolutely was no effort on their part to prevent the public from having access to their proceedings. And we think that is, that's a great model to have. And we're just puzzled by the revisions that have been made to HR 40. And that's why we just don't support it as it's currently written. So perhaps if we could now maybe open the floor for questions and comments.
Well, I for one want to say thank you. This is Ray Mariella, and I'm all I can claim to have been is somewhat of an activist, going door to door, getting people to sign up to vote and things like that. But I think I can distinguish myself here from most others because I was born and raised in Evanston, Illinois. And I'll just say I always used to laugh when Evanston referred to itself as the lighthouse in the sea of educational darkness. And now maybe there was a hint of truth to that. But my question is in a much narrower area. You've covered an extremely broad area, going back to 40 acres being promised and then never given. But I'm a scientist, a techno nerd, and when I started my life, I always wanted to be a nerd when I grew up. And so I knew if I would just study algebra and calculus and partial differential equations and engineering, demonstrate skills in it, that I could probably get a job. And I never thought about whether I would have an advantage or disadvantage because of my skin color, among other things, because Evanston at least tried very hard to make complete equal opportunity. But I suspect that I missed a large amount. I'll get to that in a minute. But part of that was when this was of course 1960s, early 60s, when I was in high school, I was on a gymnastics team, and one of the star gymnasts was a black student. And I was walking in downtown Evanston, and he had a big sign up, and with a group of other blacks who were calling for civil rights. And I knew him, and I won't say his name because he would probably be embarrassed just by association with me. But I walked over and I said, "What are you doing here? What's going on?" And he said, "Don't you read the newspapers?" And I said, "No." I was completely oblivious to everything that was going on, and he was keenly aware of it. We were both in exactly the same community. So my feeling is I have missed out on a lot of what was going on in the United States. But what I've slowly come to realize is that if your goal is to be good at differential equations and engineering and things like that, that we weren't all starting from the same place. So let's say today, 2021, you want to, I understand you want to deal with the people who didn't get their 40 acres and such things, but But what about
No,
for,
we want to deal with the
No,
descendants of the people.
descendants.
I'm
who
sorry, I'm
didn't
saying the
get their 40 acres.
the descendants, but what if you just look across everyone and it's the white privilege effect is what I'm thinking of, that how do you at least in a narrow field where it's very it's less subjective, more objective, how do you help everyone have the same opportunities to learn algebra and calculus and such things, when what I've slowly become aware of is that some people have to work just to stay alive, and I only had to work summers. So that meant when the school year was running, I could just do nerd stuff, and people who were trying to compete with me couldn't do that. So in a more general sense, and maybe that's off the topic of what you're looking at, but I'm thinking of educational opportunities. If you believe that educational is a critical training for certain jobs,
Certainly, educational training is relevant to is highly relevant to specific jobs. The question that we're raising is whether or not education in and of itself can address this enormous gap in wealth that is race linked. And it's an enormous gap that does not exist because Blacks are deficient in education. Because the individuals who are highly educated in the Black community have considerably less wealth on average than comparably educated whites in the United States. And we're arguing that this is a consequence of intergenerational transmission effects. The kinds of transmission effects that you're actually saying benefited you in terms of your capacity to not have to work every day of the year while you were trying to be a strong student, and those differences are racially weighted. And so in addition to talking about the 19th century, where the federal government pursues a policy of land allocation as the way in which it builds assets, and it only builds the assets for white Americans and not for Black Americans. In the 20th century, the federal government pursues a set of policies to promote home ownership and the development of the middle class, but they do this on behalf of white Americans and not on behalf of Black Americans. And here the Evanston story is relevant because the Evanston City Council set as the period for identifying where the atrocity took place in Evanston, the interval 1919 to 1969, in which redlining and other discriminatory practices took place with respect to home ownership in Evanston, Illinois. Now, from our perspective, that's really a national story, because redlining was a federal policy. It was a policy that was a public-private partnership that was generated by the Federal Housing Administration and HLA. And so we think, once again, the federal government is the culpable party. But in Evanston's own attempt to do something that they're calling reparations, they really are identifying the racial difference in the application of home ownership opportunities within Evanston, Illinois, as the basis for the type of program that they've established.
I want to say something too about this question about land. I mean, you initially said something about the 40 acres, and we don't look slightly at this different playing field that the federal government set in place at the end of the Civil War. As Sandy said, the freedmen were promised 40-acre land grants, and this would have been, land across the southern belt of the country, stretching from the Sea Islands of South Carolina all the way to the mouth of the St. Johns River in Florida. This would have been, an opportunity for them to set up housekeeping, to get their family started with economic footing. And in fact, 40,000, of the families were settled on property. But then Abraham Lincoln is assassinated, Andrew Johnson becomes president, and he reverses all of that. This was land that had been abandoned by and confiscated from the Confederates. That's the land that they were settling the freedmen on. Beginning in 1862, you had white Americans who were receiving these 160-acre land grants, as Sandy was saying. So, I mean, think about that. I mean, first of all, already the government has set in place a 4-to-1 differential. You know, so freedmen are getting, 40 acres, white people are getting, and even, recent white immigrants are getting 160-acre land grants. One of our colleagues, Jennifer Mueller, has looked into, the history of a number of families that benefited from these programs. And too, if it's Jennifer Mueller in this case, of the German family, there was a German immigrant who came to the United States with his family, and either he wasn't aware of the Homestead Act, or he hadn't figured out how he could tap into that. So he bought some land to farm with his own money, but he didn't do well. He had to capitalize it himself. You've got to support yourself while you're developing the land. And he was failing. So he sends his family back to Germany. Then he gets a homestead, right? He gets a 160-acre homestead. He does so well that he's able to bring his family back from Germany, and they thrive. Okay. Then in another instance, and this is the research of the students of Trina Shanks Williams. So she asked her students, college students, to look, interrogate your own family's wealth position. A lot of the students had been, told that, my parents worked really hard, they were brilliant, they had a really good idea.
And all of this is probably true. Yeah.
So they had a dream, they pursued it, they were dogged and determined, but they did not have, family stories that included the GI Bill. And they absolutely didn't have family stories that included the receipt of a Homestead Act. But when the students talked to their parents and their grandparents, over 25% of them discovered a Homestead Act land patent in their families. And in one amazing case, it's a family that in 1880, so these are the grandchildren who are reporting this in class. In 1880, the grandparents received a land grant in the panhandle of Texas. There are 8 children. They decide, the parents decide to lease the land. So they're receiving a revenue stream from this free government land. And then the father dies, and his widow decides to move with her 8 children to Austin, Texas, to increase the likelihood that the children could go to college. 6 of them receive a college degree. They emerge debt-free. She dies. And then the 8 children determine that they will continue to lease the property and divide the profits 8 ways. Then in 1980, a full 100 years after the initial receipt of this single 160-acre plot of land, this free equity from the government, natural gas is discovered on the property. And in that first year alone, the revenue stream is over $100,000. So it's like, these white families were receiving basically like a monthly dividend check from the federal government. So, this is why, Ray, why you were able to only work in the summers, because you didn't have to contribute to your family's income. So it's interesting. My very first job where I punched the clock was in Fort Worth, Texas. I worked for the public library downtown. I was so proud of that job. I loved the library. When we were 4 years old in my family, your birthday present was your library card. So we didn't have a lot of money, but we read books and we loved the library. So there were two Black girls. I was 15. 2 Black girls who worked with me. I'll say their first names, Marie and Johnny. And payday came, and they invited me to go with them on their lunch hour. They were going to go shopping. And it turns out that both of them were buying clothes for their brothers and sisters. And I was, not thinking, my family wasn't well-to-do, but I didn't have those kinds of responsibilities. But I remember I blurted out, like, why are you using your money to buy them clothes? And then immediately I realized, oh my gosh, this is a necessity. And they were very proud. They're very proud of the fact that they were making a salary and that they can contribute to their family in this way. But they didn't have, a land grant, probably, I would bet money, in their history, just as my family doesn't have any land grants. So in the same class of Trina Shanks Williams, there were 150 students. About 100 of them were white, who self-identified as white, and 50 as non-white. And of those 50, 12 or 13 of them were Black students. 25%, a little more than 25% of all the white students had a land grant in their histories. None of the other 50, none of the Black students and none of the other non-white students had a land grant. It's significant. When you think about wealth, being passed down, accumulates at compound interest. This is land that you could subdivide, you could lease it, you could, if there's any lumber on the land, if there's any livestock, any wildlife on the land, that's yours to consume, to sell it. Yeah. You could give the land itself to your progeny, or you could give them the profits from it. And this is what white people did do. And we're not saying that was a terrible thing. We're just saying it should have also been made available to Black Americans.
I wanted to comment on the fact I personally come to this issue because both my parents were concentration camp survivors. Yes. And came to the United States as I did. I was born. They met in Germany. I was born there and came to the United States when I was 2.5. My father worked very hard as a house painter. My mother worked hard as a housewife over the years. But the reparation payments that they received were of enormous benefit to our family, and made it possible for us to have a stable and a good life. So I certainly appreciate the importance of the issue of reparations and the issue of intergenerational wealth and the long-term consequences of that. I would like to get a better understanding of kind of the economics of how something like this would happen because of the sheer scale of what we're talking about here in terms of dollars. You're talking about, something that's hugely larger than any other legislation that I'm aware of that's ever passed. And how would this be funded? How would this happen? Would it happen? Do you envision this as kind of like happening all at once or spread over years? And the other thing I was wondering is whether you would envision the legislation that would also make it possible for the descendants of slaves to sue corporate entities, other entities that were that clearly economically benefited from the enslavement of African Americans. I know that's something that also happened for Holocaust survivors, that they were able to do that.
Yeah.
Thank you.
So there have been attempts to actually bring lawsuits against corporate entities that were engaged in the slave trade or engaged in slavery. In our case, of course, we are not limiting the claim for reparations to the period of enslavement. I mean, we're very much convinced that nearly century-long period of America's legal segregation is a sufficient foundation for a claim for reparations in and of itself. But there have been court cases that have been focused on the question of slavery and the complicity of particular corporations with that. And there has been no success in bringing those suits forward. The courts have essentially said one of two things: either that these cases are being brought long after the statute of limitations has been exhausted, which is peculiar given the fact that Black folks could not have brought court cases forward with any degree of ease during the years of enslavement, but so be it. But the second argument that's embedded in this is the notion that certainly these corporations did things that were immoral, but for the most part, it all happened under the law, that it was legal. And so that raises the question as to which level of government was responsible for the legality of these kinds of practices. And that would place the burden back on the federal government from our standpoint. Now, if these in the German case, the actual payments that came from corporations came in an ultimate sense voluntarily. I mean, they certainly were pressured to do it and should have been, but I don't think that there was any legal compunction for them to ultimately do it that was written into the law. And so from our perspective, if these corporate entities in the United States wanted to make voluntary contributions, or if we pressured them to make voluntary contributions, that's all well and good. But it's really the federal government that is the ultimate culpable party because of the legal and authority framework that shaped the atrocities that we're talking about. It's also the federal government that has the capability to do it. You're saying that this is a sum of money that's really larger than anything that has been brought forward. Well, I'm not sure that it's hugely larger than the amounts of money that have been assembled recently for the purposes of trying to cope with the pandemic. And those are monies that were mobilized by the federal government without actually increasing taxes. The danger with any new expenditure of funds that is unmoored from taxes is the potential for it to cause high rates of inflation. But that would be the case with any expenditure project that's new, and you would have to try to structure it so you could minimize that. And so in the final chapter of our book, we talk about something that you just mentioned, which is the idea of spreading the payments out over time. We say that it should not be spread out beyond a decade. But if you were to do it over the course of a decade, if you're talking about $12 trillion, you're talking about something like, no more than $1.5 trillion per annum. And that presumably, if it's done in such a way that the funds are provided to people as a less than liquid asset, that they couldn't spend it immediately outright, then you could minimize the inflation risk.
Like an endowment account or an annuity or
a trust account. Yeah.
Something like that.
So, I mean, these are great questions, but I think that they are logistical issues that really can be addressed.
Yeah, I have a question. And first of all, thank you again for the marvelous presentation and your work, which to me, the most brilliant part of it is the quantification, the $12 trillion figure. It's a daunting figure, but it's a real figure, and it's a great place to start. And I agree with your basic contention that it's the federal government who enabled and passed the laws and ought to bear primary responsibility. But I'm wondering, when you talk about the inequality of wealth, the responsibility of the corporations that were enriched through slavery and racist institutions, and whether or not something like a wealth tax, an actual transfer of money from the corporations, might be incorporated as part of the funding.
So I think we're receptive to that as a possible approach, but we would want to be sure that what was taxed was actually transferred.
It didn't end up in some other pocket,
right,
some other.
Right. Because that's always, a wealth tax in and of itself doesn't ensure that the funds that are taxed away are actually going to support the redistributive project that we have in mind. The other thing is, of course, in principle, you could close the racial wealth gap simply by taxing wealth away. But we don't advocate that as the way to do it. I mean, there's not much value in driving white levels of wealth down to black levels of wealth.
Do we have any other questions?
Yes, Brody, I have a question. Thanks.
Oh, there you have your raised hand raised. Yes, thank you.
Hi, and just to echo what everyone else has said, I really, really appreciate the time and the great information is very valuable that you've shared with us. And I have a two-part question. I've actually read your book, and the last chapter, as you mentioned, talks about the tax, but it also, about the potential for the inflation increase. And I wanted to find out about, like you said, to help eliminate that, you could spread out the payments over time. But I'm wondering, the inflation that we're seeing now as a result of the COVID and how that was kind of all in the one lump sum or a few lump sum payments that was passed by the government, by the federal government. You know, we're seeing higher prices at the gas pumps and in the grocery stores, but it's not really that much. And this was all at once. So my first question is, why, I guess, would we have to be so concerned about the inflation, and to the point where we would have to really spread out the payments over that long of a period, 10 years? And then my second question is, as it relates to the last chapter in your book, where you did talk about a commission overseeing it. And if I remember, I thought you said there would be salaries. There would be these, I guess, 12 members, and they term out every 4 years or something. They would phase in and term out, and they couldn't come back for a second term until they sat out one term, but there would be like a rotating commission, and they would be paid, I believe, over $200,000 a year. And I didn't really understand that part. So I'm wondering if you could explain.
So the commission that we're talking about there is a commission that would be administering the actual reparations program. And these individuals would be
Like administrative staff.
But they would also, these individuals would have a full-time position. This is very different from the commission that's envisioned in HR 40, which is not a commission to actually execute a reparations plan. It's a commission to develop a proposal or develop proposals for reparations. And so, we think that the commission that we're describing in our book, which would have the responsibility for management of the National Reparations Plan, is one in which it would be appropriate for the individuals who are serving on it to actually be paid. Now, with respect to the question of whether or not we really should worry about inflation, I'm not convinced that the current rate of inflation that we're experiencing is something to be fully exercised about. The only danger is the question of whether or not it will accelerate. And if you do have accelerating inflation, then you have a diminished value to your currency. And in the most extreme circumstances, you can plunge into hyperinflation, which would be extremely dangerous. It's associated with the rise of authoritarian regimes. Although we've had an authoritarian regime in place without much inflation, but you know, the historical circumstances in a country like Germany, you know, you can make an argument that the eventual emergence of the Nazi Party did bear some relationship to the fact that the country had undergone hyperinflation some 10 to 15 years beforehand. So that's really there's from our perspective, there's a major political concern about the consequences of having extremely high inflation. And you don't get to high inflation unless you start with low inflation. So you've got to make sure you keep inflation low.
Okay, and then finally, I'm sorry, another part, I don't recall whether or not it was addressed whether this restitution payment would actually be taxed as well.
No, it would not be. It would not be. It would be tax-free.
Okay,
Just like the
Homestead Act lands were tax-free.
perfect. Okay, thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Brody, question?
Well, I think Cheryl was next. Cheryl said it. Sorry.
Thank you, Brody, and thank you to both of you for a great presentation. I'm going to take this from another angle, because I think that every time we talk about reparations and restitutions, especially to people with, let me say this, whose skin has been kissed by the sun, there's always the question of how is it going to be paid for. Nobody ever wondered how it was going to be paid for when Black and Latino and indigenous people were being raped, their cities were being raped and pillaged. Nobody asked about that. Nobody asked about how we were going to pay restitution to East St. Louis and Tulsa and many of the cities that were being burned down during these times of racial animus. Nobody asked what was going to happen when this last president stole all of our money and then got out of Dodge. So I'm not concerned about how it's going to be paid for. What I'm concerned about is what happens if we don't do this. This has been long overdue for centuries. Centuries. And the issue is not how, is when. When, right? We have HBCUs, both of my sons, in Morehouse and Spelman. We have many people who go to historically Black college and university, and then Hispanic serving institutions, and the Native American or indigenous serving institutions. And we end up paying more than these state or predominantly white institutions, PWIs, these state schools, where billionaires and millionaires' children get served, and we're the ones who end up with this massive debt. So I would like to say that part of this reparations package is that those children who go to these HBCUs should not have to pay, period. Period. Why are we paying $50,000 when this country owes us a different kind of debt? $50,000 a year, not total, a year. Those schools are not funded. They do not have these massive endowments, right? Right. And on top of that, this government is not giving the type of support that is owed to these institutions, and is doing its best to not support these students. And when they come out with this great education, Morehouse College, for those of you who do not know, Morehouse School of Medicine graduates some of the top doctors and graduates the most, not only Black, but doctors of any type of ethnicity in this entire country. Whereas you have other institutions, including Harvard and Yale and Duke, where only less than 1 or 2% they admit Black doctors into their programs. So why aren't they?
Let me add that you know, it was mentioned that I had the Samuel DuBois Cook Center on Social Equity, and Dr. Cook was an alum of Morehouse College, and he was a classmate of Martin Luther King Jr. and very, very close friends. Yeah.
And why are we funding these? So I would like to give you the recommendation that they should be part of our recommendations in this package. So yeah, my comment is just that we ought to be looking at this. Everybody right now, the language du jour is about equity and diversity and all of these buzzwords. But when it comes down to it, are we really committed, especially Democrats, are you really committed to equity and inclusion and diversity and access if you're not committed to these things that we're talking about right now? And instead of finding excuses for how it's paid for, let's look from it from the other end and be committed to not only paying for it, but maybe you have to give up something else to make sure that we actually have equity and access and inclusion. Thank you very much.
Ellis, you have a question?
Yes, I actually have a suggestion. When I hear that they're going to tax corporations, it seems to be that whoever is making the suggestion loses track of the fact that corporations have only one source of income, their customers. So whatever penalty we put on a corporation, it shouldn't be kind of a fine or a tax. I have a suggestion. If a corporation, for example, has 100 million shares out, they should be made to publish another maybe 1 million shares and give it to a government-run mutual fund, which could be used to fund reparation. That way, we're actually taking wealth away from the people who own the corporations because their stock value is being diminished. In this case, by my suggestion, 1%, but there's nothing magic about 1%. But the idea is to take it away from the owners of the corporation rather than passing on the bill to the customers of the corporation, who are just you and I and everybody else. It just turns out to be a tax on consumers, which we know are regressive taxes anyway. It becomes very progressive when we take wealth away from the owners of corporations, particularly publicly held stock. Your feelings on that, please.
I think it's a very interesting idea. It resembles to some degree the policy that was pursued in Malaysia under the new economic policy, where a portion of the publicly traded corporation shares were purchased by the government and set aside for the native Malay population. And this is a little bit different because you're saying that they should increase the total number of shares rather than get the benefit of increased government demand for their existing pool of shares. And so I think it's a very interesting idea. And I think it's something that should be explored or considered. I don't know that it's always the case that the consumers are bearing the burden, depending upon how the tax is applied and what type of corporation, though. Because, for example, JP Morgan Chase has an accumulated, $3 trillion in assets? And I'm wondering if there would be a way to actually tax their assets, which would not necessarily have any significant effect on their customer base.
Well, when you talk about taxing their assets, those are the stocks that are owned by the people who have accounts at Chase, JP Morgan Chase, right? If you have an account at Schwab, that isn't the value of Schwab. If you own shares in Schwab, if you own shares in JP Morgan Chase,
right,
that would be the entity that was increased in size, taking off a little slice for the government and put it into, I'm calling it a mutual fund because I don't know what else you would call this mess of different stocks. And those stocks would be returning dividends. And now you've taken that wealth and you've really returned it to the people who might benefit from it, the people who deserved it. And I will reserve judgment on how you sort that out. That seems to me a can of worms to me. But let's put that aside and just say, where are we going to get the money? Let's get the money from the people who own the corporations, not the people who buy stuff from the corporations. And by the way, corporations don't have any other source than their customers, or they can say, we're going to sell some more stock. And that's how they can get more. But there's no other place they're going to get money from. Unless they have a sugar daddy, I don't know.
Good idea, Ellis.
Thank you, by the way.
I want to thank our speakers.
Another
It was
question really quick.
I think we're going to have to bring it to a close. I'm really sorry, but I just want to thank the speakers. They have been wonderful. You've really given us a wider perspective and opened our eyes. So thank you so much, Kirsten and Dr. Darity, for being here. We appreciate you so much.
Thank you. Thanks for having us. Good.
Thank you.